Welcome to the YouTube version of the sermon for the 2nd of August 2020. I can't believe August is here, and it's great to share this with you. And it's a shame that if you're using Facebook, you can't get the other stuff from the service that we're doing on Facebook. But I guess for some of you, the sermon part is really what you want to hear. So we're going to have a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Now, last week, looking at chapter 5, said there was just a huge amount of things in this chapter, and you just had to be really selective, and so I was. Chapter 6 is a bit different. Paul does what Paul does best. There are scholars who believe that what we have in chapter 6 is a little bit of a combination of all sorts of different sources, perhaps including material from what are known as the lost letters of Paul to Corinth, on which you'd have to go back and listen to the first talk on 2 Corinthians to understand what I mean by that. I think probably more likely Paul was in the habit of getting diverted. He would be talking about something and then he would go off at a tangent, just like most of us do. And chapter 6 is kind of full of this. So what we are going to do really is avoid the bits where he goes off at a tangent. And we're going to be looking principally at verses 1 to 2, verses 11 to 12, 11 to 13, and then moving on into chapter 7 and verses 2 to 4, because Paul didn't put these chapter numbers in, you understand. He just wrote, or dictated perhaps, and when the Bible was put together, it was divided into chapters and verses and so on. But essentially, it's one letter. So anyway, let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and start at verse 1. I'm using the today's New International Version. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 1. As God's fellow workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, "In the time of my favour I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you." I tell you, now is the time of God's favour. Now is the day of God's salvation. First digression. We put no stumbling block in anyone's path so that our ministry will not be discredited. Rather, as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, in great endurance, in troubles, hardships and distresses, in beatings, imprisonments and riots, in hard work, sleepless nights and hunger, in purity, understanding, patience and kindness, in the Holy Spirit and in sincere love, in truthful speech, and in the power of God, with weapons of righteousness in the right hand and in the left, through glory and dishonour, bad report and good, genuine yet regarded as impostors, known yet regarded as unknown, dying and yet we live on, beaten and yet not killed, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich, having nothing and yet possessing everything. We have spoken to you, freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children, open wide your hearts also. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God has said, "I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore come out from them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you. And I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty." Therefore, since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. Make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I've said before that you have such a place in our hearts that we would live or die with you. I have spoken to you with great frankness. I take great pride in you. I'm greatly encouraged in all our troubles. My joy knows no bounds. So, leaving aside the digressions, and I'm really tempted to go into verses 14 following, and what this actually means in practical terms for Christian living today, about not being yoked together with unbelievers, and what that says about Christians marrying people without a Christian faith or going into business with them, and how we combine reality with ideal. I would love to get into that, but I'm not going to, partly because it's a minefield and partly because my heart is actually elsewhere in this chapter. And I want to start at the beginning and talk about kairos and chemera, the two Greek words that are used here for time and day. Paul quotes here from Isaiah 49, verse 8, in the day of my favour I heard you, in the day of salvation I helped you. And then Paul says to the Corinthians, you've heard this prophecy, now is the time. It isn't always the time in this sense. The word time here is kairos. It isn't chronos, from which we get chronology, which means the tick, 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 ticking of a clock as it goes round. Kairos means, like we would say, your time has come. We don't mean that it's this particular configuration of the hands of a clock. We mean this is the moment of opportunity. And likewise with the word day, the day of salvation, it doesn't really mean that it's Sunday the 2nd of August 2020. It's recognising that an appropriate time has come. Often in Hebrew poetry, what happens is that the first part of the verse says something and then the second part repeats it, but just using different words. And that really is the case here. In the time of my favour I heard you, in the day of salvation I helped you. Excuse me, bit of hay fever, a lot of harvesting going on around here at the minute. And so Paul, in quoting this, then says to the Corinthians, look, the time is now. And I say this now because I believe that we are in a kairos moment. I mean that both for the UK church, possibly the global church, but certainly for the UK church, we are in a kairos moment. And as the outgoing, as it were, pastor of Whitley Lodge Baptist Church, for those of you who are listening to this who are part of Whitley Lodge, probably most of you, Whitley Lodge is in a kairos moment. And this is one of those significant times where it's really important to act now and to get it right. Some of you know that I struggle a lot to play a game called chess. I love chess, but I'm not particularly good at it. But I love watching people who are very good at it. Sometimes I watch people play who are much better than myself. And usually in a game of chess, a chess game will last usually about 40 moves, around about 3 hours at the sort of club level I play at. And often the first several moves will happen very quickly because they're not at a significant juncture in the game. And a point will be reached in the game where both players spend a lot of time over their next move, sometimes half an hour, sometimes 3/4 of an hour over one move, because they recognise that this is the critical turning point of the game, and what happens next will determine probably the outcome of the rest of the game. And so I spent ages over the next move because it's vital to get that move right. It might only be moving a pawn one space or something like that, but it is absolutely crucial to get that right, because what will flow from their decision is the whole of the rest of the game, and so they reach this critical juncture. I usually haven't got a clue what they're doing and what they're thinking, but they do know what they're doing. And a kairos moment, the day, the chimera, the Greek word for day, is like that. It is a crucial moment. Paul says this is a significant moment, a kairos moment in your existence. And I want to say that I passionately want the UK church to hear this and to understand it, that the whole business around the coronavirus epidemic and the way it has effectively shut down the physical meeting of churches is, I believe, a kairos moment. God is saying, look, you can make a clean break, you can stop what you were doing, and you can turn, you can do something else. Now, don't get this wrong. Often what we want to do is wait. We want to prevaricate. And sometimes the time for prevarication is over. I've recently been laying some slabs outside my back door, front door. We have two back doors in this house, for my motorbike to sit on, and bought slabs, prepared the ground, got the cement ready, and really I spent ages finding reasons not to actually physically lift up the slabs and put them in place. I think because I was terrified that I'd done something wrong, that this wasn't going to work. And so I put it off, and I fiddled around here and I fiddled around there. I'll do that tomorrow, you know. And I was so fearful of getting this wrong. But the point came, and I just ran out of excuses and said, look, these slabs have to go down. It is the time. Fortunately, so far, everything's fine. The motorbike has a nice new hard standing. And leaving that aside, we are, I believe, at a kairos moment, a significant turning point. For Whitley Lodge, that is bound up not simply with the whole business of not being able to meet physically and having to do so much online. It's also bound up with your decisions that you will make and others will make about a new minister, if you like, the ministerial vacancy. This is a crucial moment. Don't miss it. Don't allow it to pass. To use another phrase, a Latin phrase, carpe diem, seize the moment. And I want to move on from there, because the other things I want to say are not really to do with that. I want, but they do relate to how the church is, and relate certainly to the approach, the whole business of finding leadership and how the church responds to it. And for this, we go beyond Paul's description of his hardships, to which he returns later in the letter, and we'll perhaps deal more fully with them then. And jump to verse 11, where he says this: "We've spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened our hearts wide to you." Paul does something that he only does 3 times in all of his letters. He uses what's called the Greek vocative, which is to do it in English, you put the word "o" in front. Sometimes the Greek does put "o" in, and Paul says, "Oh, Corinthians." It's an expression of deep affection and the deepest appeal. The one that's really well known, similarly, is Galatians 3, verse 1. "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" Paul very, very rarely uses this language. Here he says, "Oh, Corinthians," and the reason he's doing that, he's sharing his heart. You want ministers, preachers, pastors, leaders who will share their heart, who will let you into what's going on in their hearts. And Paul says, I've shared myself with you. He uses two phrases here. He said, literally, he says, my mouth stands open or remains open. When he says, we have spoken freely to you, literally he says, my mouth remains open. Sort of almost bringing ideas of sitting in a dentist chair. It's a perfect tense of the verb anoigo. And a perfect tense means it is complete action in the past. So he's really saying, my mouth stands open. And what he means by that is that in my speaking to you, in my language, in my sharing with you, there has been no deceit. There has been no misleading of you. I have said things as they really are. I've spoken to you in complete openness and freedom. And he goes on to express the same thing about his heart. We've opened our hearts wide to you. Again, it's a perfect tense. Our hearts have been completed action. Our hearts have been open to you. It's the perfect of Platonine, which is which you could sort of use in the dentist. It's sort of open wide. That's what it means. It means to open something wide. Our hearts, as well as our mouths, are wide open to you. And Paul is saying we've been completely truthful with you, completely honest with you, and our affection towards you is undiminished and genuine, and there's nothing hidden here. There's nothing hidden in our words, there's nothing hidden in our feelings towards you. Ah, wow. Isn't that a wonderful thing to aspire to? What a wonderful way to live. I would aspire to that as a minister. I think I have aspired to that. I'm not sure I've always achieved it, but I've aspired to that. That words are, and language is completely open, and feelings and love is completely open. If we could live like this, that we would speak simply and truthfully and openly. And we would love freely and truthfully and openly. But we don't. One of the great sadnesses for me is having to translate church language. People don't speak. People don't say what they actually mean. They say something else. I encountered this first of all in when I was first looking to, effectively a student. I'd returned from a year in Dallas, and I was looking to find my first pastorate. And I met a number of groups of deacons, and I got asked a question. I can't actually remember what the question was. I didn't quite understand it, and I sort of tried to get through. Well, what are they getting at here? I don't quite understand this. It was to do with funding for a new building, and I went back and spoke to my college principal, Ray Brown, and he said, "Well, yeah, what they meant was, are you opposed to fundraising initiatives?" And I thought, well, why didn't you say that? Why did you not ask that question? And another church I went to had a ministerial vacancy, and I went there to spend a weekend with them. And I went and I met them, and they asked me to meet the leaders, and that nobody mentioned this ministerial, and they mentioned their manse without mentioning that I could be a prospective new minister, and they even gave me a tour of the manse. And they were lovely people, don't get me wrong, it was a lovely place. And it was a good church as well. I think I'd have been very happy there. Or perhaps I wouldn't, because on the Monday morning after the Sunday, one of the church leaders was taking me back to the station, and he said, we've got this ministerial vacancy, and we're thinking that, maybe it's something you might be interested in. And I said to him, yeah, I possibly would. You're a lovely bunch of people, but why weren't you open with me about this to start with? Then we could have had sensible conversations over the weekend about whether this potential arrangement has any legs. Oh, blow me, that was it. I must have upset them, because I never heard a thing from them again. Or perhaps it was my preaching. But I felt really sad, because I can sincerely and truthfully say I've always tried to say what I mean and to mean what I say. Why can't we do that? We have this habit. One of the things we do, I think it's a bit of a middle class thing. Perhaps it's because I have working class roots, I don't do it. We have this ecclesiastical understatement. So I've learned, for instance, that certain phrases mean certain things, because in our churches we tend to understate the case. So I know that if somebody says to me, Paul, I'm not sure that's the best idea in the world, what they mean by that is I'm pretty sure that's a bad idea. If they say to me, I just don't think that'll work, what it means is, are you completely out of your mind? Have you totally lost it? And so I've had to learn to translate church language. Wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to do that? But more serious than that, because that's, in some ways, that's quite comical. It's almost cultural. But the worst thing is the closed heart. Paul says we've opened our hearts to you. Our affection to you is authentic and genuine. Please open your hearts to us. It's really, really sad when our hearts are shut to each other. When we speak of love and we don't really mean it. I find it one of the most heartbreaking things as a minister is when you realise, because of the way that somebody is acting, that you must have done something to upset them somewhere. You really don't know what it is, but the affection is missing, and they won't tell you. Sometimes people play a game of you've got to guess what's wrong with me, and you just see the affection that was once there disappear, and you don't know why it's gone, and they're not telling you. And that happens between Christian believers, not just between leaders and people. How sad that we can't that we can't retain our love for each other by being honest about what we say. And you see how these two are related, because we don't open our mouths, in other words, speak truthfully and honestly and freely, then what happens is that when we have things that we feel badly about, it creates a barrier, and we don't love with genuine affection. Wouldn't it be great if we took a resolution that said, from now on, we're going to speak the truth in love and gently, but we're going to be truthful with one another. Our words are not going to be disguised. We're going to be honest and truthful and open. And our affection also will be genuine. So open your heart, says Paul, and open your lives. And Paul says the problem is that whereas our hearts are open to you, your hearts are not open to us. And so that's what he says in verse 13. As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children, open wide your hearts also. And then he gets another digression. He goes off on one, as my beautiful wife would say. And not to say that this isn't just as inspired scripture, but it's almost a big parenthesis. And then in chapter 7, verse 2, he comes back to the point. Make room for us, he says. Make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I've said before that you have such a place in our hearts that we would live or die with you. I've spoken to you with great frankness. I take pride in you. I'm greatly encouraged. In all our troubles, my joy knows no bounds. Paul uses a couple of really wonderful metaphors here in talking about making room in our hearts. I don't know if you remember chapter 4 and verse 8, where Paul says we are hard pressed on every side. And if you can remember that, I spoke about it being like a narrow mountain pass, and the path gets narrower and narrower and narrower as the hills get higher and the walls go up on the side until you feel quite crushed. It's the same verb. Paul says, make room for us in your hearts. And why shouldn't you? And then he comes out with three very short statements where he says, we have wronged no one, we've corrupted no one, we've exploited no one. It's like a machine gun firing. As a pastor, but hopefully as fellow Christians, wouldn't it be great if we could all say this? We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. We haven't played church politics. We haven't manoeuvred to get our own way. We haven't acted in any kind of underhand way. We haven't done anything that would damage anybody, at least not unknowingly. We haven't taken advantage of anyone's vulnerability or weakness. The great difficulty in churches that stops people being vulnerable is because that vulnerability can be exploited. I believe I've tried to live honestly and truthfully as a pastor and be real about my own failings and weaknesses and shortcomings, at least some of them anyway. The great danger in that is that there have been times where that has been used against me. For instance, there have been times, and going back a way now, where I've shared some of the weaknesses and some of the struggles I have, only for some church leader who's a bit grumpy with me, some way down the track to say, yeah, well, you're saying that because we know you have a problem with this. And it's an exploitation of somebody's weakness. It's a taking advantage of someone's vulnerability. It would be great if we can listen to each other, we can be vulnerable, we can share what's really going on in our lives and be truthful about it. If we can do that and not take advantage of each other, that would be brilliant. And so Paul says, make room for us in your hearts. That instead of the space contracting and being more and more confined, open your hearts wide. You won't go very far wrong if you open wide your heart. You may get hurt. You may get taken advantage of, but I believe that is a price worth paying. I'm going to finish with a little bit from Ralph Martin's commentary on 2 Corinthians in the Word series, because he takes time and trouble to read, to quote extensively from John Chrysostom, who was an early church father, very early centuries of the Christian church. And this is part of John Chrysostom's reflection on Paul's relationship as father, if you like, spiritual father, to his spiritual children. I'm going to read this to you. It'll take a couple of minutes, but it's worth listening to. Just as what brings heat makes things expand, so it is the gift of love to stretch hearts wide open. It is a warm and glowing virtue. Love caused Paul to open his mouth and expand his heart. I do not love only by words, he says. My heart itself joins in the song of love, and so I speak with confidence with my whole mouth and my whole heart. Nothing was wider than the heart of Paul, which embraced all the saints, just like the individual lover, in close bonds of love. And yet his love did not stretch to breaking point, nor become weak, but remained whole in every case. What wonder that he had such feeling for the saints, when even in the case of unbelievers, his heart embraced the whole world. And so he did not say, I love you, but, and this is more emphatic, we have spoken frankly to you. We have opened wide our hearts. We have all men in our heart, and not merely that alone, but with ample room. For he who is loved wanders in the inmost heart of the lover without any fear. Accordingly, Paul says, on our part there is no constraint. Any constraint there may be is in yourselves. Notice that the reproach is uttered with restraint, which is the mark of lovers. He did not say, you people do not love me, but not in an equal measure, nor does he wish them to be too bitterly reproached. It is evident in all his writings how he burns with love for the faithful. Choose quotations out of every epistle. Writing to the Romans, the apostle says, I long to see you, and I've often made it my object to come to you, and if in any way at all I may have a prosperous journey to you. To the Galatians he speaks as follows, my little children, with whom I am again in travail. To the Ephesians again, for this reason I kneel in prayer on your behalf. To the Thessalonians, what is our hope or joy or crown of boasting? Is it not you? For he said that he carried them round both in his heart and in his chains. Furthermore, he writes to the Colossians, I wish you to see how great a conflict I wish you to see how great a conflict I have on your behalf, and on behalf of those who have not seen my face in the flesh, so that your hearts can have comfort. And to the Thessalonians, like a nurse who cherishes her charges, thus we yearn for you, and we wanted to give you not only the gospel, but even our lives. On our part, there is no constraint, he says. He does not say only that he loves them, but that he is loved by them, that in this way too he may draw them to him. And about them he bears this witness, Titus has come bringing us your longing, your tears, and your eagerness. In this kairos moment, in this hemera of opportunity and challenge, may we rise to the challenge, but may the way we do it be in a way of complete openness and frankness and truthfulness of speech and absolute authenticity of love in vulnerability to one another. Thank you for listening. See you soon. Bye bye.